Right, I think we'll make a start. Good evening, everybody. My name is Louise Davies, and I'm the Director of Christians on the Left. Welcome to our Tawney Dialogue 2021, and the theme is Families or Factions. I am thrilled to be joined with our three speakers tonight. We have Dawn Foster, who will be chairing the meeting for us. We have David Lammy, and we have the Reverend Sam Wells. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, the event tonight will be recorded. So if you prefer for your face not to appear on the recording, perhaps you'd like to take the camera off. Also, feel free to tweet about tonight's event, and the hashtag is Tawney 2021. And there will be a function later for you to submit your questions to David and Sam. So if you'd like to submit your questions, you can submit them through the chat function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And Dawn, our chair, will be able to see those questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get us through as many as possible. Well, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dawn Foster, who is going to be hosting and chairing our event tonight. Thanks, Dawn.
Thanks, Lou, and thanks everybody for joining us on this very cold Monday evening. It's obviously a very peculiar time at the moment, and so we thought that we would talk about something that was very, very close to everybody's heart in the middle of what essentially is an unprecedented pandemic. Obviously, you know, in the past 5 years, when it comes to politics and when it comes to faith, families, factions, politics, and all sorts of different types of tribes have been very, have been at the centre of politics. And we wanted to talk about what family means to people, what tribes we identify with, and whether politics is becoming more polarised, and what good can come out of identifying with certain tribes. So as Lou mentioned, we'll start with both of our speakers giving a short speech, and then we'll have an open dialogue between the three of us, and then we want to open up to as many of you as possible. So to start with, we will have a short sorry, my web connection's gone a bit. So to start with, we will have a short speech from Reverend Sam Wells, who has been at St Martin's in the Fields in Trafalgar Square since 2012. Was that right, Sam? So without further ado, I'll invite Sam to give some remarks about what family and tribes and factions mean to him.
Thank you, Dawn. Thanks for having me. There's been a battle going on at least since the 18th century, and arguably since the early chapters of the book of Genesis. It's a battle between two antagonists, neither of whose positions are, I suggest, sustainable. On the one hand are the Universalists, sometimes known as the citizens of anywhere. Universalists maintain that there's one human identity, one human good, one human destiny. Universalists invariably find that identity, good, and destiny in the tradition to which they themselves are to be found. What an extraordinary coincidence. A coincidence Universalists seldom acknowledge. On the other hand are the tribalists. Tribalists deny any universal ethic or politics and are bent on pursuing the agenda of those with whom they feel a deep bond, in which the blood of creed, shared antagonism, or class warfare seems to run thicker than the water of consensus and compromise. The problem with universalism is that it consciously or unconsciously masks the assertion of one particularity, usually one with a less than self-aware access to power. The archetypal universalist was Ernst Troeltsch. He regarded Christianity as the only religion that had recognized historical development and emerged with unconditional, worthwhile goals. Troeltsch had a name for that historical development. He called it Europe. A contemporary version of a similar tendency is Mark Liller. In his 2007 book, The Stillborn God, Liller says, "We find it incomprehensible that theological ideas still inflame the minds of men, stirring up messianic passions that leave societies in ruin. We had assumed that fanaticism was dead. We were wrong. Lilla's agenda is very different from Troeltsch's, but what they share is their equally entitled and correspondingly partial use of the word we. Meanwhile, Oliver O'Donovan notes the genealogy and contemporary manifestation of universalist assumptions. Modernity, he says, began with 3 centuries of conquest and issued in colonialism, which eventually morphed into communications. Globally transmitted images promised to circumvent obstacles presented by differences of language and nationality. O'Donovan points out how unsurprising it is that this has been fingered as neo-colonialism and has thus spawned Islamism as a revolt against the universalism of Western communications. The term tribalist has a negative connotation. It's a derogatory word used by universalists about those whose commitments seem to arise not simply from rational transparency, but from primal or consanguinal codependencies. But whether tribalists accept the designation or not, a number of forces that have proliferated in the last decade share pride in the rejection of the purely rational, the realm of the expert, and the reduction to the economic. For example, many supporters of Donald Trump share a sense of betrayal and dispossession that's constantly fueled and deeply felt, whether it's factually based or not. Brexiteers are praised for their allegiance to place and the local, to sovereignty and identity in the face of the universalizing and thus flattening and utilitarian EU. Much tribalism rests on an appeal to implied atavistic purity, a sense that the citizens of nowhere are disturbing the primordial integrity of races or cultures. Adam Rutherford's timely book, How to Argue with a Racist, dismisses the foundational assumptions on which such arguments rest. He says over a 500-year period, you have 1,048,576 ancestors. If you go back 1,000 years, the number of your ancestors is more people than have ever existed. This is because the same individuals appear in your family tree multiple times. In other words, we are all interrelated. Hence, as he says, every Nazi has Jewish ancestors. Every white supremacist has Middle Eastern ancestors. Every racist has African, Indian, Chinese, Native American, Aboriginal, Australian ancestors, as well as everyone else. Racial purity is a pure fantasy. For humans, there are no pure bloods, only mongrels enriched by the blood of multitudes. If this is true for genetics, how much truer it is for other cultural, political, and ideological tribes. All claims to purity collapse under scrutiny. A tribe which claims to be the ultimate claim to primal solidarity turns out to be the ultimate construct. So we recognize that universalism is simply particularism in a shouty voice. But we perceive also that tribalism is not the answer to the exposure of universalism as a self-serving fraud. And before we move on, let's not suppose family is a step up from tribalism. The book of Genesis may be an unsteady guide to the origins of the universe, but it's spot on when it comes to the power of familial dispute and sibling rivalry to derail any project of peace. Feel the withering words about Abraham and Lot in Genesis 13, laconically repeated about Esau and Jacob at Genesis 36, quote, "For their possessions were so great that they could not live together." What might be a better approach than tribalism for living without factional strife? There are 3 great challenges that, leaving aside the pandemic and the climate emergency, constitute the great issues of our time. The first is how humanity is to cope with rapid, widespread, and unprecedented social change. It's not wrong to build up associations based on common interests and convictions. In political terms, it's the only way to promote social goods and protect core values such as upholding the weak. The second challenge is how associations negotiate difference of identity, purpose, and commitment. It could be that respective understandings of how to navigate difference will come to be more significant than ideas for how to promote policy. After all, as Tony Benn liked to say, democracy is not just about the rule of the majority, but about being safe to be in the minority. Minorities tend to forget this when they turn into majorities. As Kin Hubbard put it, I wonder how long the meek will keep the earth after they inherit it. The third great challenge is how each one of us, each person on earth, comes to understand our own identity, given that the differences of our day are increasingly manifested in the experience, body, and self-understanding of the individual. As witness, see how rapidly the meaning of gender has changed from being synonymous with sex and invariably binary into a spectrum of identities and social roles of almost limitless variety. The challenge for most people is not to identify where their loyalty lies, but to find a way to live with constantly multiplying and conflicting loyalties and identities. Lest we forget, Christianity does have a vocabulary for many of these things. In place of universal, it has the word Catholic, which means a conviction that in Christ there is a fundamental human persona, and that the myriad forms humanity takes are all rooted in God's desire to be in relationship with us. In place of identity, it has the word baptism, which means that our destiny with God is more foundational than our race, sexuality, gender, class, or other signifier. In place of diversity, it has the word Pentecost, which, unlike Babel, portrays difference as gift and creative tension as dynamic opportunity. In place of conflict, it has the word church, a community in which everyone brings their different gifts to the table and receives back the same, in which all discover they are one body whose purpose is to glorify God through truly enjoying one another. We're told in 1 Peter 2, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. That sounds suspiciously like a tribe. But the opportunity of Pentecost is to incorporate what the original tribe, Israel, was first told about its calling. In you, Abraham was informed, all the families of the earth shall find a blessing. If Christianity inherits that calling, one of its defining roles is to create spaces in which others may find a blessing. The crucial theological insight is that it does so not out of a bland tolerance that seeks to live and let live, nor out of a loose pluralism that believes one conviction is as good as another, but out of an eschatological vision that God's future is one in which diverse voices, while remaining truly themselves, are brought forth into divine harmony. Thus, the Church's calling is to live God's future now. Instead of being a nascent or local branch of a tribe, every church should be a collection of such diverse voices, modeling what reconciliation means. Such a community transforms the notion that conflict is a wearisome indication of weakness or an embarrassing sign of failure into one that regards creative tension and God-given difference as the source of life in abundance and renewal from the forgotten corners. The point of Catholicity is to believe that God's house has many mansions and there's room for everyone. The point of baptism is not to restrict one's company to those also baptized, but to take such confidence from the assurance that one's destiny is hidden with Christ in God, so as to make space for those who believe and practice differently. The point of Pentecost is to manifest that God speaks in many languages and through diverse cultures, even ones it's hard to understand or at first agree with. The point of church is to be a kingdom community, living God's future now, as kaleidoscopic as the gloriously rainbow heart of God. In face of the question, do you know who you are? In a fast-changing world, few people find it easy to settle on a single answer, and the temptation is to be defined by what you're not, and thus accept the tribal mantle and a false story about where you're coming from. But a better question is, do you know where you're going? And if the answer is to a future in God that is dynamic, diverse, and drenched in wonder, then the only way to live is to embody that future now.
Thanks, Sam, that was great. We'll now hear from David briefly, I think.
Well, you're going to hear a reading from my book Tribes. Can I associate myself with everything that Sam has said? I spent 300 odd pages saying something very similar, and because I did that, it's just easier to read, to give you a sort of sense of where I'm coming from and the inquiry that I went on in writing this book, which was both an examination of the increased tribalism that we're finding in our own country and across the world, but also a sort of memoir, a way of me examining the tribes that make me, and why, very sadly, here in the UK, I find myself increasingly under attack, and people questioning my right to sort of be here, really, in my Englishness and Britishness. In this new era of tribalism, the rational is increasingly being replaced by the emotional. The logic of the global liberal order, which for so long enjoyed political hegemony, is being attacked in almost every modern democracy. The universal values that were its basis, all humans are of equal value. Cooperation is better than domination. Freedom is an intrinsic good, are now being questioned. The tension was obvious in the BBC's 2019 UK general election leaders debate, where an impassioned member of the public bluntly asked the two prime ministerial candidates that in light of the recent London Bridge terror attack, will you put public safety ahead of human rights? Human rights are designed to protect individuals, but as this question highlighted, some are growing suspicious that a rights-based order poses a threat to their group. Tribalism is natural. Humans intuitively sort themselves into in-groups and out-groups. Our need to belong is hardwired into our brains. Yet what these groups are based on, our nation, our skin colour, or even our football team, is somewhat arbitrary. We need to belong to groups, but there's nothing inevitable about the specific groups to which we belong. Countless psychological studies back this up. In one such experiment, toddlers aged between 4 and 6 were divided into groups. One group was given red t-shirts, the other blue t-shirts. Both groups were shown images of other children, whom they had never met, but were wearing either red or blue t-shirts. At no point did the teachers mention shirt colour, but by the end of 3 weeks, it was clear the children favoured one children wearing the same colour shirt as themselves. I'm now just going to read a longer extract from a chapter that I call Jerusalem, which is really an examination of part of the England I grew up in, which was in Peterborough. Although I'm associated very much with Tottenham, and there is a chapter that looks at my Caribbean heritage and that sort of hybridity, really, of people coming to this country and becoming this country. This chapter is based on my experience in Peterborough and going back to that city, which I'm very fond of, but where there are many friends who have very different political views to me. A part of me will always be in the Fens. I've been going back to Peterborough regularly ever since I left. In this time, the train from King's Cross has speeded up, but the infinitely flat landscape and the sickly sweet smell of sugar beet on arrival has not changed. When I last visited Jameson's parents after a long interlude, it felt like a family reunion. 5'9", in good shape but with greying hair, Clive stood proudly in his Peterborough United football shirt and jeans. I met him at the John Lewis car park after making the short walk from Peterborough station. He greeted me with a sloppy kiss on the cheek. We drove in his Fiat to the bungalow he shared with Kathy. Though different to the house I stayed in as a child, it felt familiar. Their bungalow was immaculately clean, with photos of their children and grandchildren lining the walls, a large TV in the corner of the front room, a glass coffee table and a faux leather suite of one sofa and 2 chairs. We sat and belonging. I felt as relaxed as a teenager visiting his grandparents for Sunday lunch. It was a home from home. They told me I hadn't changed a bit. We reminisced about the past. I had adored living in Peterborough. In my mind, it was a suburban paradise. But the previous week, I had read the I Live Here had made the city the winner of the annual Crap Towns survey. This award was based on responses of nearly 50,000 people, one of whom described Peterborough as the biggest dump in England, with aggressive and inbred residents. Another said you feel totally isolated from the rest of the world and life in general, as though everything else is going on and you're not part of it. You're stuck in this dump. Take a trip into the town centre and it's like walking into a city of the Walking Dead, he said. Peterborough was far safer in the 50s and 60s, Kathy said, laying down a fine spread of freshly made sandwiches, Keith Lorraine, and a pot of her hot tea in the sitting room of their modest bungalow. I would go out till 11 o'clock at night after I left school at 15 and come home on my own. Fine, I'd go into town to go skating and to dances. I'd get on the bus. I'd have 10 minutes walk home to the bus stop. No worries at all. I wouldn't go out now. I wouldn't go to the end of the road. Peterborough was a nice town, Clive said. Oh, it was lovely, said Kathy. We first met in the dance hall at the centre of town, the Palais. We would meet up with a couple of friends. We'd go to the pub. We'd go to fish and chips. We'd go bowling. I remember when the first Chinese opened in Peterborough. You wouldn't do that today, though. It's scary now, Kathy agreed. Clive and Kathy pointed out that their children, Jameson and Sarah, took the short walk to school when they were just 5 or 6 years old. Even in Tottenham in the 1970s, I can barely remember ever being taken to school by my parents. Today, the school run has become like a scene from the wacky races in which vehicles travel bumper to bumper, clogging up the streets with more speeding cars and pollution. It's not only Clive and Kathy who are feeling insecure. In the UK, nearly 2/3 of adult women and 1/3 of men feel unsafe walking home after dark. Their fears are being passed on to the young, with 3/4 of British children spending less time outside than prison inmates. Knocking on doors across Britain at election time, I hear the same sentiments of fear and insecurity. At family weddings, gatherings and birthday parties, in Chichester, Ludlow, Solihull, Birmingham, Southampton, Bristol, Bodiam and Edinburgh, I hear similar articulations of this feeling of apprehension. There's the general sense that while the technology we use, the food we eat and the TV we watch have improved, what lies outside the front door is in rapid and serious decline. When I asked Clive and Kathy what the source of their anxiety was, they're quick to pinpoint immigration. Clive said sometimes it's like being in a different country, really. The Tottenham I grew up in was a melting pot of ethnic groups, white English, African Caribbeans, Irish and Cypriots, to name just a few. By contrast, Peterborough was dominated by the white English. There were some exceptions. Peterborough had a vibrant Italian population since the 1950s, when the London Brick Company advertised for workers in Pugila and Campania. When I was there, I do remember a small, very small West Indian community, which I sought out whenever I needed a haircut, as well as a growing Pakistani community. It was the 2004 of the EU, however, that made Peterborough a prime destination for Eastern European migrants. The original pools were cheap housing, fast access to London, and relatively high employment. The restaurant owner and chef, Damian Waltzenek, is a pillar of the local Polish community. He told me on a previous visit, as we cruised down the multi-ethnic thoroughfare of Lincoln Road, that Peterborough's total population of nearly 200,000 was made up of nearly 30,000 Eastern Europeans. Though its centre is ancient, dating back to the mid-7th century, Peterborough was paradoxically designated one of the new towns in 1968. New houses, streets and neighbourhoods were built to accommodate overspill from London and Birmingham, where inner city living was crowded and there was little space for new families. Plans were drawn up to create thousands of new homes and jobs. Like other new towns of Stevenage, Harlow, Crawley, Peterborough grew rapidly as a result of deliberate strategy to encourage people from cities to move in. But in recent years, the rate of change has been unprecedented. Many of the areas of the UK that reported most dissatisfaction with immigration in recent years have experienced the least of it. Peterborough is an exception. 21% of its population are now non-British nationals. This is more than twice the figure for the UK overall. Over the 10 years from 2002, Peterborough was the fastest growing city in the country, rocketing by 27,600 to 186,400. The right-wing press has been quick to dump on the city as an example of the dangers of immigration and multiculturalism. Under the headline, Peterborough, Brexit migrants, the last English pub left, in July 2016, the Daily Mail quoted Bram Brammer, barman at the Hand and Heart, said to be the last pub left in the city's Millfield area, as saying English people are leaving and it's becoming ghettoised. The society's infrastructure has been destroyed. These sentiments closely echo the words of the hard Brexiteer and former Conservative Peterborough's MP Stuart Jackson, who in 2006 described suburbs that were previously settled and peaceful becoming ghettoised. He then declared that resentment, anger, and hostility is rising in the host communities, and claimed that the police spend time keeping desperate communities from conducting turf wars, which prevents them from tackling routine crime. Clive sympathised. When I go into Peterborough every Monday, I go on the bus, he said. The bus stops in Millfield, which is now Eastern Europe. Clive said that the same of Longthorpe, another formerly affluent suburb of Peterborough that had been taken over by absentee landlords who were being rented to Eastern European tenants in houses of multiple occupation. We moved 14 years ago because an Asian gentleman bought the house next door and put a dozen Eastern Europeans in it, Clive said. They used to work shifts, so some used to come home from doing a shift and others would be going to work. So we lost all the privacy. We went from having just one couple next door to having a bunch of blokes. It wasn't very pleasant. They constructed a building at the bottom of the garden and had people in that. They didn't have planning permission for it. Foreigners get away with murder in this country. Clive and Cathy are not the only ones to blame for what they perceive are injustices related to immigration on successive governments. In fact, political scientists have found strong evidence to suggest a general growth in discontent with politics in the 50 years preceding Brexit. The National Centre for Social Research report provides evidence that this trend has been accompanied by a distrust of politicians in general terms. The proportion of those surveys who trust the government to place the needs of the nation above the interests of their own party fell by more than half, from 38% to 18%. The political scientist Matthew Goodwin has argued that one major driver of Britain's growing crisis of distrust in the 2000s, measured by data, is the pace of immigration. I'll stop there, but the book explores not just immigration, but that lowering of trust, the rise of hate across society, why people question my right to be English and British, but also the ways in which we've got communities like the Windrush community that are in so many ways quintessentially British and a fundamental part of this country. It go to examine the solutions and the way in which I believe governments have to put at the centre, really, a sort of rebuilding of our country, a common purpose, if you like, the nation building that's sometimes taken for granted in newer countries or countries that have experienced real trauma, real pain, like Germany after the war, or indeed Japan, and have to rebuild again and therefore dedicate themselves, all politicians, to the business of bringing its country back together. And can I just say that, you know, this is a time when many are reflecting on how America comes back together, how it heals again. I think it's been very depressing, whatever side you were of on the Brexit debate, that actually that attempt to bring the country back together has not taken place by this government. Indeed, there's almost been a continued tribalism as those that won the debate sort of dance over the tomb of a country left behind.
Brilliant, thank you, David. We'll now move to kind of generalised discussion, and we've got some questions to go through. I mean, I think often when it comes to tribes, we talk about tribes in the media and you know, and in wider society as being predominantly a kind of negative thing, but often it can be, it's, you know, especially in the current climate, it can actually be a force for good. So I suppose to turn that on its head, what are the favourite tribes that you that you would say that you belong to, and that you would happily say that you belong to? Sam, you can go first since David's just been speaking for 10 minutes.
Oh, well, I think it was Groucho Marx who said I wouldn't belong to a club that would have me. So I'm quite a mongrel myself. I've always, as a personality, been reluctant to commit myself to what I guess tonight we're calling tribes. But if I had to choose one, I'd say I'm very proud of my grandparents who were refugees and my mother who was a refugee herself. So I've always been glad to be in the company of those who've had to give up everything and start a new life and discover who they still were and what they were glad to become. That would be the tribe, I think, with whom I feel the most sense of resonance.
And you know, and day to day in your work with the church, I mean, how do you think tribalism kind of comes into the kind of pastoral work you do, and how do the people in your kind of wider community view tribes, do you think?
Oh, well, speaking of the church, I mean, I always say about you know, St. Martin's is thought of as being you know, on the radical edge on a number of issues. I always say there's nothing more conservative than the liberal church, and I say that because the tendency is to be very committed to an issue that was very important in the world 20 years ago or so when I started coming to this church. So I, however, do, when it comes to Christianity, I very much associate instinctively with those who are concerned about poverty, which has always been the biggest issue for me since I was a teenager. For those who actually want to do something about it rather than just talk about it, and who don't afford themselves the luxury of liking off other Christians, which I just think we haven't got time for. We've got more important things to do. So, you know, those would be the kind of places I'd locate myself church-wise, I think.
And David, for you?
Well, I'm a Spurs supporter. Rooting for Spurs.
That's fine, as long as it's not Arsenal.
We were playing an underdog. I enjoy the banter with fellow Gooners just 3 miles down the road. So that's a sort of you know, positive thing that I'm part of, and I suppose it matters to me really because my dad left our family when I was 12. I never saw him again, but he did used to take me to watch Spurs, and so there's something about taking my own children to watch Spurs that really resonates with me and sort of connects us to place here in North London. But of course, as you know, football can too turn into something quite ugly and quite nasty, both in our own country and in other parts of the world. But that's probably the sort of a good positive example of what, what one can be part of. I mean, listening to Sam talking about his faith, I try not to have a proselytizing faith, because I think that's a problem when you're a member of parliament, but my faith is actually incredibly important to me, my Christian faith. And again, it connects me backward in time. Now, for me, that also touches on another theme, and that is, I am actually incredibly proud to be the descendant of African people who were enslaved, because they got their freedom. They set up a village in Guyana in South America, my ancestors, and they called it Hope Town. It's the village that both my parents are from. I'm really, 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 really proud of that. And it, of course, those people would have lost their culture, their language, their religion, but they adopted a new one, and it's one that I still have hundreds of years later.
Excellent. And I had a few questions. So if people do have questions, if you just post them in the chat function, and we'll hopefully get to as many as possible. So for the next question, what do you think a two-party system kind of currently says about our nation? I mean, obviously, David and Sam both briefly touched on America, and they have a two-party system, and increasingly in the UK, thanks to proportional representation, it feels as though we get further away from a two-party system. So how does that kind of affect tribalism? And obviously, David has a slightly different slant on this, and so I'll go with you first, Sam.
Oh, well, Dawn, if there was a perfect political system, we'd all be using it, wouldn't we? They've all got advantages and they've all got flaws. As I understand it, David obviously knows a lot more about this than I do, but we have to balance the desire for strong government and empowered government, and not constantly looking over your shoulder government on the one hand, and representative democracy on the other. My worry is that in our efforts to abolish tribalism, we just end up swapping one tribalism for another. So I wonder, for example, how much of what people object to about kind of bureaucracy and proceduralism of Central European politics, how much of that is just the habits of compromise and coalition that the Central Europeans are largely involved in all the time, and that we feel we're sort of somehow above and beyond. So I'm skeptical of changing the current arrangements. I by nature, I'm the sort of person who inclined to say let's make the current arrangements work, rather than let's spend the next 20, 30 years finding the perfect system, which I don't think is out there.
I mean, I think I'd want to emphasize that in our system, it's really, really important to understand that both of the two main political parties are, in fact, very broad coalitions of different interests. I mean, my party has Social Democrats, has obviously socialists, has increasingly a powerful left, Christian socialists. It's and then it has an increasingly very sort of liberal metropolitan feel to it, and I would say that was incredibly secular in tone, and probably the Guardian would be their Bible. So it's our political parties are in fact big coalitions. It's because of the inequality, the nature of artificial intelligence and technology, an aging population, all those things driving these big differences, where both parties have flirted with what has been, generally speaking, in the British tradition, more on the fringe, or more, in our case, to the left and the hard left, and to the Conservatives to the hard right. I'm really clear that the British people rejected Jeremy Corbyn and his manifestation of a more leftist position, but I don't think they quite really thought about the hard right position they were adopting in terms of Dominic Cummings, in terms of Boris Johnson. Dominic Cummings, and they're sort of having to really reflect on that now, because there's no doubt about it. I don't think it's a point of dispute, but this is a cabinet in which positions that would have been more associated with in the past, UKIP, certainly the Brexit Party, has found its way around the cabinet table, and someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, there are elements to Priti Patel's politics, Dominic Raab's politics, are now mainstream positions in the Conservative Party. And I think that then becomes the challenge when this broad coalition, whether it's Conservative or Labour, sort of shifts to a place, and obviously it leaves a lot of people whose politics are broadly in the centre feeling out of sorts, really, and not at home. I increasingly, it's not front bench position, but on the back benches, I found myself persuaded by the need for PR, because I like compromise. I like having to come together. I haven't got a problem with pooling ideas. Whilst I definitely don't think anyone's going to dispute my politics are on the left, centre, soft left, probably, part of the political spectrum. David Cameron asked me to lead a review on the problems in our criminal justice system. And I don't believe that the Labour Party is the font of all ideas at all. And indeed, if you're a Christian socialist, you usually, by and large, in my experience, can find you understand that there are small c conservative traditions that you are comfortable with. In fact, notions of family are often associated with the small c conservative traditions of the Conservative Party, because Labour in office tends to want to use the state to shore up families, and sometimes loses touch with its it's not the state that lifts children out of poverty, it's families and parents that lift children out of poverty. They need the state to do that. But I think the discourse that I mean.
Great, thanks. Briefly, we were the next question was what can the Black Lives Matter movement in UK learn from the BLM movement in the US, and how much do you think BLM has changed the discussion around race in the UK in the last year?
Sam, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Okay, I'm happy to go first. I mean,
Sam, you can go first if we keep.
If I think I would say the US. I lived in the US for 7 years, up until 2012, as some people know. I would say the US is honest about its past, but in denial about its present. Everyone knows about the Civil War, Martin Luther King, Civil Rights Movement. but half the country isn't prepared to face the degree to which segregation isn't over, largely because it's not in their economic interest to do so. The UK, I would say, is the opposite. It's more honest about its present, but far from perfect. I mean, don't get me wrong, but it's in denial about its past. Everywhere I go, people are heart searching about not having enough diversity on their trustee boards or company directors, and about the prevalence of racial violence and hatred. But we still like to think we were the good guys in the slavery story, and we forget that, you know, those Western cities, Bristol, where I grew up, Liverpool, Glasgow, they were all built on the slave trade. You know, when I was at school, we never talked about it. So, you know, that would be a contrast between, a perhaps over stark contrast between the two. I mean, to me, the most compelling part of Black Lives Matter, which in a sense arguably predates Black Lives Matter, would be Colin Kaepernick's taking a knee, because that's 4 years ago now, I think. But to me, that has got a lot to teach us about the importance of gesture and the importance of capturing the imagination. And I thought that was the most remarkable political gesture possibly of the decade. And I continue to try to think about how people who care about the issues that he cares about can portray them in as compelling a way as he's done.
I mean, just briefly to pick up on something that you mentioned. I mean, how many people in the UK do you think are fully kind of aware and accepting of the of kind of racism in the UK? I feel as though, especially when the statue was pulled down in Bristol, there was even though there were quite a few, you know, protests, people were very open about the UK's colonial past. There's still a very loud and quite a large group of people who refuse to acknowledge that colonialism was wrong, and also that it still has resonance today. I mean, what can be done about kind of education about our colonial past?
Is that one to me, Dawn? Again, I certainly don't want to hog this one because it's not really mine to hog. But
okay.
Yeah, well, I suppose I would regard that as a perfect illustration of our difficulty in talking about our past. I mean, obviously, the distinction between past and present is artificial, as you pointed out. But I was sort of making it to make a point about how. You know, when I taught students in American university, they were very conversant about the language of Civil War, civil rights, and so on. I just don't think people in this country growing up are significantly educated in what made this country call itself Great Britain.
I mean, can I get in here? Can I get in here?
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
Time, and it's a good time to get in. Again, I think you've put it incredibly well in terms of the differences, but I think the truth is it's deliberate. It is deliberate. It's by design, and it's important to understand that Black people make up 4% of the population here. They are a minority. On one level, one might say that, you know, in a democracy, a civilized democracy, how you treat minorities is incredibly a very powerful indicator of the kind of values and the kind of country that you are. And very, very sadly, the UK's inability to reckon with its colonial past. And might I say, this is not just a past in relation to my ancestors. I mean, it was extraordinary. We had members of the cabinet that didn't seem to understand the past in relation to the island of Ireland. Just in the run up to the debates, ask our Irish brothers and sisters about this story and they'll educate you. They're way more educated. back to what we learn and what we continue to learn and what we leave out. And we're very good at the two H's. We're very good at Henry VIII and his wives and the birth of the Church of England. And we're very good at beating Hitler, but we leave out a lot of the in-between, is the truth. And even when we do, the amount of conversations I've had where the rush to talk about the abolition of the slave trade without wanting to talk about the several hundred years in which this country was built on the backs of it is extraordinary. And then not to pay any tribute. No one knows the name here in the UK of any of those who led slave rebellions and fought for their freedom in the West. They have no idea. People like Coffey, like Sam Sharp, they don't know who these individuals are. That's how ignorant we are. And it's to say that what ties us to America is the fact that probably if you did a straw poll of most people on this who are participants in this session, they would describe me as black. I would describe me as black. But of course, it's what we don't fully understand is the fact that I am black is a construct that was begun here in this country. It was the scientific racism that was invented really here and certainly in Europe that really allowed white European aristocrats to go out and colonize the world and put themselves above everybody else. And we're still living with the legacies of that. We're living with the legacies of it in European countries, and we're certainly living with legacies in what I would call white settler countries like the United States, Australia, where things are horrid actually for many people who are indigenous with Aboriginal background. There's a lot to do. This will not change, sadly, overnight. The Black Lives Matter struggle is that. It is a generational struggle that will go on for some time, and perhaps we'll get to a place where I can be described as being of African descent, and that means something. And that idea of being black, because the black-white premise was set up, starts to recede. And of course, as Christians, we'd like to get to a place where we're all human beings. But that's also another sort of fallacy. There's a tendency in Britain to say, well, we don't see race, we're colorblind. I can't tell you, that's the biggest load of BS. It's impossible to be colorblind in a world in which there is so much disadvantage attached to the color of your skin, and in which effectively there's a caste system. And anyone who doesn't understand that should read Isabel Wilkinson's book Caste. But when you're reading it and understanding a lot of her descriptions in relation to the United States, just reflect that a lot of it is also relevant to our country. One other example I'll give you. A couple of years ago, actually it's more than a couple of years ago, it's 4 years ago, then again 2 years ago, I challenged Comic Relief and the way that they chose to raise their money. And my constituents thought I was a hero. They were delighted. They've been switching off Comic Relief in droves because they can't stand the portrayal of Africa. They can't stand the fact that most primary school children get their understanding of the continent of Africa from Comic Relief. And they don't like the white saviorism. It's Victorian, but it still goes on. And, significant white populations didn't understand what I was on about. Years later, Comic Relief have finally said, look, we're actually going to move away from sending celebrities out to do this stuff. And it was about really giving Black people no agency, even in the gimmicks that they used. It's not that we don't believe in aid or we don't believe in support or charity. It's about what does partnership really mean and what does equity mean? Not just equality, but equity. And if the 19th century was a century in which finally slavery came to an end, and the 20th century was a century in which rights and freedom were won, then it's my sincere hope that the 21st century is a century where we genuinely begin to repair and reconcile and get to a degree of truth.
Thanks, David. Just to carry on. The next question was about Brexit. So the question was, could tribalism have been avoided when it came to Brexit? And what will it take to reconcile the country now that we've had essentially 4 years of extreme polarisation and tribalism? And what do you think would be a good starting point? I'll go to Sam first.
I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable about being first on all of these because David was on such a roll just now. But I'll just be brief. I'm going to be outspoken on this one. I think Brexit goes back to our country's denial about its colonial past. We have a profound myth that we have overachieved as a small island, probably because we invented all the sports, and therefore we have a right to win them every time the competitions come round. We forget that while we were singing Britain's Never, Never Shall Be Slaves, we were enslaving half of West Africa. And I think that just leads to the idea that any impingement on our sovereignty is inhibiting our natural right to dominance. Forgive me if I'm treading on toes by saying those things, but that's what I feel. And to answer the question of what do we do about it now? Well, we've seen what moves us on. And that's realizing there's something more important than sovereignty. Currently, that's a pandemic. We need to concentrate on issues where we find an identity deeper than defining ourselves against each other. We've got one of those right now, and we're right in the middle of it, and we're not enjoying it one little bit. But it does mean we're talking about Brexit an awful lot more. And families that were divided about Brexit find that that was a bit of a luxury when they desperately need each other in the midst of a pandemic. So, the best way to overcome division is to find something far more important where you profoundly need each other. But I do think the Brexit thing, I think David articulated brilliantly in his discussion of Peterborough. That was such a vivid portrayal of the issues in the last 15 years. But to me, there's another layer of issues that go back to the construction of British identity as being this punching above our weight, astonishing miracle of this tiny island that rules the world by our innate fantasticness, which of course the Commonwealth are just begging to become the empire again, now that we have the opportunity to trade with them, having done this fantastic deal. Sorry, I'll stop there.
It's fine.
And my views are very well broadcast, and I'm not going to repeat them. Safe to say that I think that there are some genuine issues around change, globalization, inequality, growing, the loss of jobs and work, the hoarding of wealth and power here in London and the Southeast. These are very, very big issues. They're not issues unique to the UK. They're issues that we see all over the developed Western world. And they're issues that are hard, really hard. Climate, they require definitely a coming together, that they require profound, consistent work. And, there are grown-ups in the world getting on with them. Angela Merkel. And then there's everybody else. Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro, Modi. And it's frightening. And, there are many who think that what happened in the States is the natural conclusion of this episode. I'm afraid I'm far more worried than that. I think it may be the prologue. Because in the end, millions and millions of people have voted for this, not just in the United States, but here in our own country and in others. I have huge hope in the millennials and in Generation Y. I think they're a great generation. They get a lot of this stuff. But they're some way from power. around. Many baby boomers, you know, we are very much in the driving seat. So I do think that things will get better, but we're still in for a bumpy period. And clearly the pandemic recession that follows, we're in for another round of othering, because all of those problems I described, which are big, immense and hard, are being reduced basically to a debate about difference, immigration, and a kind of ethnocentric idea of patriotism and nationalism. That's what's happening in the United States, and it's what's happening, what we've seen happen here in the UK.
The next question is, how tribal is the church? I mean, if as well as answering the question about how you feel the church is, you know, predominantly, I think the audience will probably appreciate just a very brief kind of description.
Let me start. I'm not terribly happy with the church, I've got to tell you.
Who is?
I've never lost my faith. My faith means the world to me. I go to church, but I certainly find I'm sort of Anglo-Catholic in tradition, but evangelical in style. And I find that, you know, having been a chorister, having grown up in the Church of England, been on the Archbishop's Council, I'm pretty steeped in the Church of England, and I have to say, it doesn't impress. It doesn't impress as a force in our country. I'm increasingly sort of, you know, frustrated really with notions of church, not so much faith, but notions of church. And strangely, in my sort of Anglo-Catholic senses, I might well be sort of, you know, find myself coming, because there are tremendous issues also with Catholicism. Let's not pretend that there are profound issues, difficulties, challenges with Catholicism, but there's a certain kind of firmness, for example, on issues like refugees, that I find incredibly attractive.
Yes, Sam.
Well, churches, other Christians, and probably mercifully, all the other Christians aren't just like me. If they were, I think the church really would be worthy of the criticism that it often gets. It's made up of diverse people. It doesn't make a great job always of harnessing the gifts of all the people that God has given it. But to me, you know, that the picture that captures my imagination is the one in Ephesians 2, breaking down the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile. So it's fundamentally about bringing two peoples together, finding the water of baptism is thicker than the blood of identity. And tribalism is an identity based on fear. So as long as there's fear, there'll be tribalism in the church as much as anywhere else. You really have to, as a grown-up, and particularly as a Christian, you have to go out of your way to spend significant time with people who are different from you, and not to patronize and savior them, but to spend time realizing how impoverished your life is if you haven't received the things that only they can give you. So, you know, the church doesn't do itself a lot of favors by feeling its job is to protect, you know, fiercely to protect traditions or truths to the bitter end and see almost everybody else as a threat to them.
Do you think as well the church kind of offers maybe something that a lot of other institutions don't? I mean, you touched on it briefly there, but it's a space in society where a lot of us go, and we know, you know, the instant we leave our the instant we leave our front door to go to church, that we will meet a lot of people who are very, very different to us, you know,
Yes.
in terms of age, in terms of social background, etc. You know, it's very, very hard to find that sort of kind of social, yeah. David?
Yeah, that comes full back round to getting beyond tribes. I call it in my book an encounter culture. And that's the bit of church that I find attractive. It's why I have sought to raise my own children within the church. And it's that fellowship. There's something quite wonderful, crazy, ancient about a bunch of people that really hardly know each other often, singing together on a Sunday morning in chorus and harmony, you know, and just, you know, being in communion with one another. That is a huge virtue. And I think because of the siloed nature of modern society, the way that technology is almost driving us apart, I think that kind of communal sense is fantastic. Now, you can get it at White Hart Lane in a sense as well, but I've always found that fellowship in church just hugely, you know, it means a lot to me, which is why, you know, I still do it.
I think. Oh, could I just respond to White Hart Lane for a moment? I mean, it seems to me there's three things here: that the church is made up of people who believe there is another reality, which is bigger and more important than this one. Who believe, second, that reality has made contact with us in a particular human being at a particular time in history, who offered, you know, a divinative revelation of what that other reality is fundamentally all about and will be forever. And the church is, thirdly, those committed to follow that person and try and live that reality, or to use the phrase as I used in my remarks, live God's future now, to live that reality now. That's, you know, in three simple steps, that's what I think it's all about. And so I do find something in common with almost any Christian or anybody who is prepared to take, you know, 1, 2, or 3 of those steps, which, you know, although Spurs used to play before about 18 months ago, very attractive football, you don't really find that at White Hart Lane as a matter of course. You find it, of course, at Newcastle United, but that's a conversation we'll have offline.
We'll go to questions from the audience now, and anybody else who has a question, by all means, to send it to me via the chat function. I'll pull them out for Sam David. Sorry, I'm choking to death now. We have a question from a Peterborough supporter, so just to continue on football. So Jonathan Dickens mentions that that when David talks about tribes, he's very, very rooted in place, so Peterborough, so Tottenham, etc. But modern tribalisms are often a lot more diverse, so they're about social class, obviously, but also kind of fluid understandings of race, sexuality, education, consumerism, etc. And so his question is more about has our understanding of what tribes are changed, and how do we get to a more intersectional kind of more diverse kind of understanding of what tribalism is, and how can we bring that into politics?
So look, there are complexities within this, which I do explore in my book. I really talk about a new tribalism as a way of landing on this thing that's going on that makes a lot of us feel very uneasy, to be honest. And I think it has got a feel, hasn't it, of a sort of ethnocentric sense of itself. So here in the UK, in England, there is definitely a bunch of people that do not believe I can be English. I might be able to be British, but I can't be English. And in my book, actually, after quite a lot of self-examination, I insist that I'm English. And that theme is playing out also in the United States, which is very tragic in a way, because despite the United States' sense of its deep and problematic racial politics, it has always had a powerful tradition of anyone can be American. But actually, what we're seeing is there's a pecking order, and that's what white supremacy is, and it's on display in real time. I think when you mention terms like intersectionality, that goes to another idea and concept which we haven't really talked about today, but it's definitely something that I explore and think a lot about, and that's identity politics. And, you know, identity politics is a politics that gets a kicking from the left and the right, the politics of identity. But the way I want to summarize it in the book is to say that, look, I defend the right to talk about a politics based on identity. And the reason I want to defend that right is because really for most of modern history, if you were a woman, you were controlled by your father or your husband. If you were black or brown, you were colonized or enslaved. If you were LGBTQ, I mean, let's forget it. I mean, the idea of loving who you want to love in your own lifetime. So the truth is, the politics of identity in the 20th century is key. It's the yearning to self-actualize, to be who you want to be in your lifetime. And I find it peculiar that at the beginning of the 21st century, there's a bunch of people who want to roll that back. And overwhelmingly, they're white middle-class men. Who are the only ones who had it all their way. And really the conversation is about sharing. However, I also say identity politics cannot be the beginning and end of the conversation. It really can't. It was never designed to be a total preoccupation. So I care about race, of course I do. But, you know, in the end, my politics are on the left because I recognize that when I'm talking about working class, I'm talking about many more people in this country, in fact, who are white. And the politics of class are as powerful. Politics of inequality are as powerful. And that gets me to the politics of solidarity that tells me that there are two big engines in the world. Yes, there's a black and brown engine in the developing world that makes all the things that picks all the things we eat and, you know, the clothes we wear and all the rest of it. But there are also these powerful and important white working class engines in Europe, America, Canada, Australia, and really we have to be in a degree of solidarity. So identity politics cannot be the end of the conversation. I think too often it is the end of the conversation. And also there's a sort of lack of generosity, I think, particularly for older generations for whom some of these notions, the language, changing language, you know, you get one thing wrong and then the sort of cancel culture jumps all over you.
Is that something that you think is actually, you know, a big problem, David? Cancel culture, is this genuinely anything other than something that the right have essentially concocted?
No, I don't see it as a concoction of the right. I think it's look, I think there are some really ugly sides of Twitter, ugly sides of social media. I know I'm on it and I'm a big protagonist of it, but I can see, and again, it's something I explore at depth, you know, there are huge downsides to this growth in social media. For a start, you know, I'm thinking of my mother here. She's not alive, but were she alive, the sort of articulacy required if you're into politics on social media, my mother wouldn't have possessed that. Would she have been pilloried for crap language or language that's inappropriate around a whole set of issues? There's an inbuilt unfairness to it. It's brutal, and it's that I find unattractive. So I mean, I don't actually these days get into conversation with a lot of people. I mean, you just have to look at my feed to see the regular diet of things that are said to me and about me, and the threats and the all sorts. But I've learned that I tend to have, if I am in conversation, if I am signaling people out, they tend to be people in public life. They tend to be people who, I think should know better. They tend not to be ordinary people these days, for whom I just don't know where they're coming from. And levels of intelligence and education and all the rest of it come into play. And I think that can be problematic, I think, on social media.
Okay, another question we had was, essentially, if most of us function in a political echo chamber, how can we get away from that and make politics more accessible to the public? And I'll go to Sam, because you didn't have a chance to answer that last question.
Well, David gave a great answer. There's no need to me to tackle that one, but I'm happy to tackle this one. And again, perhaps this is a hard thing to say, but the answer, I think, is to ensure people realise politics doesn't begin or end in Westminster, or Brussels for that matter. The most important, for me, the most important political act a Christian makes is to be a part of a church. It's that third element that I was talking about in the previous question, doing something about it. So a church should be a community of people who listen and speak and act together. And through doing those things, they discover a power they never knew they had. And that's fundamentally based on the two core Christian convictions that we've been delivered from the fear of our past through forgiveness, and we've been delivered from the fear of our future through eternal life. So I don't think that it's that David went into politics and I went into the church, to use an old-fashioned expression. David's also doing church and I'm also doing politics. I don't do my politics in Westminster, especially. I see almost every act, that the old phrase about everything is politics and politics isn't everything, I think is true. And I think pretty much everything I do is politics. And to conscientize people, to make people more aware that everything they're doing is politics, it is a great way to get people energized, organized and engaged in ways that change lives, change communities, neighborhoods, change the world in the end. My nervousness is when people say, their most profoundly political act is the cross they make every 5 years, or these days every 18 months in a general election. It isn't, that in a sense, that cross only makes a difference if they're profoundly engaged in politics in the other ways that I've been describing. And it's that second kind of politics that I've spent my life committed to.
And just before we wrap up and go back to Lou, who will tell us what events Christians on the Left have coming up. First of all, thank you both for coming, and thanks to all the audience. But I thought it'd be nice if we ended on a positive note. So if both of you had something in the past year that your church have done, or that you have done with the church, that that has cheered you up, something positive that has come out of your faith, out of your local community and church, something positive that you and your tribe have done during the pandemic. So I guess I'll give an example first, which is that obviously with social distancing, I haven't actually been able to go to church very often. When I have, I've had to be a bouncer. So it's my job to stand outside, count how many people go in, and make sure that everybody is aware of all of the rules going in. And I was speaking to one woman who first came to our church 2 years ago. She moved to Britain 3 years ago. Her English isn't brilliant, but she's getting better and better. She's really enjoying learning, etc. And I was just stood outside with her, explaining rules to people, and just happened to compliment her earrings, and she instantly kind of pulled them out. And because I'd said that I thought they were very nice, instantly gave them to me. But luckily I was able to kind of pay her back, because I felt guilty for months afterwards. And it was very, very sweet to get a message from her, and she texted me out of the blue, mentioned that she was ill, and asked if I would mind terribly if I collected some prescriptions for her. And it's just been really, really nice, the fact that even though my church can't meet up very often, normally our pews are full, we have instead been swapping numbers, and essentially helping each other as people have been ill, as people have needed their kids dropped off and that sort of thing. So having that sense of community has made me very, very happy to belong to my very, very local Catholic tribe in Southwest London. So David, Sam, whoever wants to go next.
I mean, I'd say that just before we went into the original kind of corona crisis, it was wonderful. Rhodes Hudson in Parliament confirmed my 14-year-old son, and that was very special. It was very special. And then I think the other thing in my local church, which is St Mark's, Tollington, here in Islington, sort of North London, and St Saviour's just next door, they have a fantastic food bank. There's a lot of need at the moment, a tremendous need, and again, it's watching my 14-year-old and his best mate working there on after school, supporting, and being told that they're not just a bunch of useless 14-year-olds standing around doing nothing. I've been told by the organisers that they're really great. They've got ideas, and they're innovative, and they're making a difference. So that's sort of that matters to me. It means something. It's special.
Well, since David had a couple of things, I'll take a couple of things to take a liberty. I'm just very, very proud of the work my colleague Richard Carter and a bunch of volunteers have done to keep our work with asylum seekers going all the way through the last 10 months. It's been going for about 7 or 8 years prior to that. But because the fundamental center of Christianity is God's commitment in Christ never to let us go, and that commitment never to let these most vulnerable people in our society go, and always to maintain a lifeline of relationship with them through all the difficulties of lockdown and through the pandemic. I'm very proud of the, that group of people and their ability to keep in close touch with some people facing very difficult hardship. And the other thing I'm really proud of is my colleague Sally Hitchener, who's put together a wonderful new exploring faith course, which we call Being With. And that the fundamental commitment of that is that we believe the Holy Spirit's been at work in people's lives since those lives began, and so the ability to embody, as that course has developed over the last 12 months, to people really discovering their own experience as an experience of God and an experience of the Holy Spirit, I think has people use the phrase a lot, but I have seen I've seen lives change. What I've never used that phrase about before is I've seen lives change on Zoom. How about that? So those two things have been a daily inspiration for me in the last 12 months, and I thank God for them.
Brilliant. Thank you both, and thank you all for the audience. I'll hand over to Lou now, who'll wrap us up.
I just want to say a massive thank you to Dawn, David and Sam for such a fascinating dialogue. It's been challenging at times, it's been inspiring, and we've got lots to think about as we leave this evening. There will be a recording of this event, as I'm sure a lot of you will want to revisit and capture what's being said. So thank you to all three of you. It's been such a great evening. For those who are members of Christians on the Left, please keep an eye out on your inbox. We've got a new series launching on Monday, the 25th of January, and it's called Cottle Explores. And it's for those who are feeling that God's calling them into elected office. So we're going to be in the first week exploring what it means to be called by God. In the second week, we're going to be discovering political journeys. And the third week, which is extremely practical, is going to be how to be elected. For those who aren't members, feel free to join us. Check out our website, and we would love to see you at an event real soon. Now, over the last couple of months, we've been running a raffle, as most political organisations do, and that was pulled earlier today. So I am pleased to reveal the three prizes. The first prize, which is a signed copy of David's book, Tribes, and also a choice of a Christians on the Left tote bag or t-shirt. And the winner of that prize is Amber Vincent Pryor. Well done, Amber. The second prize, which is a prestigious House of Lords oven gloves donated by our very own Jonathan Reynolds, and also a choice of Christians on the Left tote bag or t-shirt, and that goes to Ben Niblett. So well done, Ben. And then finally, the winner of the Christians on the Left tote bag, t-shirt and pin badge is David Stokes. So thanks to everybody who contributed to our raffle. Thanks for everyone who's joined us tonight. It's been wonderful to see you all, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at our next event, which is on the 25th of January. Thank you very much. Good night and God bless.